Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Sami Sorang, and joining me here in the studio today is our panel of foreign journalists. Thank you for being here.
Good to be back.
Welcome on board. Trade tensions between South Korea and Japan have hit a boiling point, with Tokyo dialing up its economic pressure on South Korea.
詳細に申し上げれば、約束を守らないという中においては、今までの優遇措置は取れない。これ間違って報道しているところがあるんですが。
And Seoul warning Japan to back down.
유엔 안보리 결의를 준수하고 제재의 틀 안에서 남북관계 발전과 한반도 평화를 위해 총력을 다하고 있는 우리 정부에 대한 중대한 도전입니다.
So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with a panel of journalists to take a closer look at the escalating trade tensions between the two countries and how the regional powers factor into the situation. What kind of articles have you written regarding this trade spat?
Well, I did a couple of video packages on this, and mostly I stressed that this was part and parcel of the historical baggage between the two countries. It may seem like an economic trade war, but it's really more of a historical dispute regarding reparations and apologies for Japan's colonial abuses on the Korean Peninsula in the first half of the 20th century.
국가植民地支配と侵略によって多くの国々、とりわけアジア諸国の人々に対して多大の損害と不幸を与えました。ここに改めて痛切な反省の意を表し、心からのお詫びの気持ちを表明いたします。
You have a conservative government in Japan that has ties, lineal ties to those colonial abuses. So resolving this in the short term, in terms of that historical dispute, is extraordinarily unlikely. What is possible is that they could come to some kind of accommodation where they're going to shelve that part of things and get back on the same page economically. But both leaders are in a position really now where it seems like they can't back down. It would have some serious repercussions for them politically. So you can see that really influencing the positions again of the two leaders.
일본은 당초 강제징용에 대한 우리 대법원의 판결을 조치의 이유로 내세웠다가 개인과 기업 간의 민사 판결을 통상 문제로 연계시키는 데 대해 국제사회의 지지를 얻지 못하자 우리에게 전략물자 밀반출과 대북제재 이행 위반의 의혹이 있기 때문인 양 말을 바꾸었습니다.
Here in South Korea, you have the public really getting involved in this dispute with, product boycotts developing as well.
So that was your article?
Well, I wrote a couple of pieces. I've just been in Japan, and there they all say, well, this is because Korea is going back on the 1965 agreement reached between President Park Chung-hee and Japan, which may seem like a lot of money, but isn't necessarily all that much. And I should also point out that the money that Korea is demanding that these companies give, about the equivalent of about $100,000, is not huge for Nippon Steel. In fact, it's basically pocket change for Nippon Steel. They can afford it.
All right, so those were your articles. What about you?
Yeah, no, last week I read a story after a briefing which was given to the Seoul Correspondents by a South Korean government official who essentially did two things. I think he very, very carefully homed in on the Achilles heel of the Japanese position, but also very clearly held out an olive branch to the Japanese saying, look, we need to resolve this soon.
근본 일본 측이 제기하고 있는 의혹과 관련하여 한국 정부는 최근 일본으로부터 불화수소를 수입하여 가공하거나 수출하는 관련 기업들을 대상으로 긴급 조사를 실시하였으며 불화수소의 수입, 가공, 공급, 수출 흐름 전반을 점검한 결과 일본으로부터 수입된 불화수소가 북한을 포함한 유엔 결의 제재의 대상국으로 유출되었다는 어떠한 증거도 발견되지 않았습니다.
再度、会議録を確認したんですが、問題提起についてはあったんですが、撤回を求めたという明確な発言までは得られておりません。
철회 요청은 없었다라는 주장이 있는데 우리는 1측 조치에 대해서 유감 표명을 했고 1측 조치의 원상 회복, 즉 철회를 요청했습니다.
And I think because for Korea, time is very much of the essence. There are less than 90 days inventory of these critical materials. So if this is not solved very, very soon, the production lines grind to a halt.
Okay. If we just have a look at the current situation and the export sanctions or the export restrictions, what might be Japan's endgame with regards to that decision?
You know, that's a good question. I think that depends on South Korea's reaction and how far they're going to go. I don't think we see the end game right now. You know, some people suggest that Japan may be more prepared and have some type of contingency plans in order. But I look at what position do the Japanese companies have in this sort of trade spat? They are the suppliers. In my opinion, it's easier for the buyer to find a new source than for the source to find a new buyer. So the South Korean companies, in their response to this, let's say diversifying their sources of these materials, right, are going to alter their dependence on Japanese companies. So I don't know if this has all been thought through on either side. And certainly both countries will end up being the losers.
That might be easier said than done for South Korea to
Find other sources?
For South Korea to find other sources from Taiwan, from Russia, from Europe, might be easier said than done. They might be able to find some other sources, but it takes a while to develop them. One interesting aspect of this is that major South Korean manufacturers rely upon Japan for intricate, highly tech parts for the machinery that makes the machinery that makes the products. And Japan is extremely good at that, and Korea is extremely reliant upon Japan in ways that are not readily obvious. And it's obvious that they need these chemicals in order to produce semiconductors, which is a huge Korean export product and product for just about everything electronic. But what about the little machines that are used to make the machines that make the machines that make the products? They come from Japan in many cases. You can't get them that easily.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Don. I think, however, that South Korean companies, not just those that, in this case, that are relying on these three materials sourcing from Japan, are going to look at this and go, do we want to be as exposed to this type of trade war in the future? 90% of the supplies of these materials, two of them, are from Japan. 45% of the other material are from Japan. And the two companies that are the leading chip manufacturers are these South Korean companies, Samsung and SK Hynix, that produce some 60% of the chips we're talking about. So the exposure in South Korea to this type of trade spat is something that CEOs, not just of those companies, are going to be questioning, but across the board as the potential potential for this trade war to expand kind of develops.
South Korea has got to reduce its dependence on Japan. That's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen right away.
Right.
But long term, looking 5-10 years from now, maybe South Korea will manage to reduce its dependence upon Japan. That could happen. It's not going to happen next month or next year.
Not in 90 days.
Not in 90 days. So this,
Right.
for this, I mean, to come back to your question, the end game we'll see very, very, very soon because the 90-day window is already closing. We were told by South Korean government officials last week that the Japanese companies have already started the application process.
향후 일정에 대해 일본 측은 리스트 규제는 7월 4일부터 이미 실시하고 있으며 화이트리스트 제외는 7월 24일까지 의견 수렴을 거쳐 가기 결정 후 공포하고 21일 경고한 날로부터 시행될 예정이라 하였습니다.
The clock is already ticking. So the end game, I think this is a tactical move, not a strategic move. I think this is the Abe government have had 6 months to think about this. They've been thinking about it very, very carefully. They waited to apply it until after the G20 and just before the Japanese upper house elections. So that the timing was carefully thought through. They can calibrate this pressure. Right now, it's 3 chemicals over a 90-day period. If I think the South Korean side is willing to talk and act from the Japanese point of view in a reasonable manner, then these restrictions can be eased and you might get the chemicals within days or weeks. If, on the other hand, the situation deteriorates between Seoul and Tokyo, the Japanese have said very, very clearly they're going to increase these export restrictions to about over 1,000 items which are on a white list. So the Japanese have clearly, it's a staged action. It's not just a one-time.
What will be the issues of greatest concern if South Korea is indeed removed from Japan's whitelist?
Well, that's kind of like the United States taking away most favored nation status in trade negotiations. Right. Obviously, this could have a lot of implications for import of Korean products, for export of Japanese products. I mean, it could be an all-out trade war, not just a serious matter of 3 chemicals not being exported to South Korea that are vital for producing semiconductors. It could extend over a wide range of products. And then you could get the business of cutting down on flights, and you could get the business of requiring visas. I mean, this can spiral out of control. But as I said, I cannot believe that both sides let it go that far. Korean business leaders, I think that they, as much, more than anyone else, are going to say, look, we got to stop this. Let's get down to serious talks and head off this crisis.
Okay, now let's talk about the memory chip prices or the changes to the memory chip prices that have resulted from this. Following Japan's introduction of new export curbs on South Korea, global memory chip prices have soared due to concerns of a supply crunch. Some experts say that Japanese export restrictions to South Korea could underpin semiconductor prices by reducing stockpiles of chip inventory across the globe.
You've talked about what will Japan do next. I mean, this is unprecedented. I can't think of a single situation offhand when Japanese has place some kind of economic sanction on South Korea. This is a very, very new ballgame we're in now. We do know that in terms of the global supply chain, both Japanese and Korean companies are absolutely critical in electronic components, particularly now, given the situation of the other trade war, the transatlantic trade war. The Chinese suppliers are now laboring under question marks. So the capacity for damage that this dispute could cause to global supply chains, global businesses, and eventually to the global end consumer are extraordinary.
There's some sense that Korea is too dependent upon semiconductors. A lot of this economy relies upon semiconductors, and perhaps to excess. So perhaps Korea should not be so reliant upon semiconductors. But beyond all this, I get the feeling, which not everybody shares, that they're coming to a crunch and that they may negotiate themselves out of this crunch.
That they may not, or that they will? They may.
I get a feeling that as they come to this crunch, as all the implications become clear, after all the statement making and all the recriminations are done, maybe they'll come to some negotiations. I'm not talking about Prime Minister Abe and President Moon negotiating. I'm talking about lower level, working level negotiations in which they'll come to some kind of a modus vivendi for mutual accommodation. Both sides are going to recognize this is not doing us either of us any good.
And I think that realization, that change in the sort of calculation of the leaders is going to be driven by business, and they're going to be saying to their leaders, "Look, enough is enough. Let's stop this." I think what's also really important is what Andrew pointed out, that this was a carefully calibrated move by Japan.
Time-wise.
It wasn't a ban. There have been no actual restrictions. It's been an announced restrictions that will take place over a period of time that requires, some increased paperwork and time in order to get an export license. It wasn't stopping the export of any product. It hasn't had any real implications on the market yet. It's just a bunch of speculation about what might happen. So I think keeping in mind that it is, again, a calibrated thing, gives us a potential, as Dawn mentioned, to come together and dial this back before there are any sort of real, supply chain implications.
All right, guys, so let's widen our focus a little bit and talk about the global impact that the current trade spat between South Korea and Japan will have on the world. South Korea commands a dominant share of the global semiconductor market, although it's heavily reliant on Japanese suppliers to provide them with the necessary materials. Many media outlets have expressed concern that Japan's export curbs could seriously disrupt the global supply chain of semiconductors and thereby also impact the supply of smartphones, computers, and other products that use chip components. Do you share that concern that the trade spat will disrupt the global supply chain?
There's absolutely no question that it will. As you said, the leading producer of memory chips is South Korea. Those are critical for pretty much any consumer electronic product. Samsung wants to get into logic chips. This is its big investment now, which again is dependent upon these Japanese materials. So yeah, I mean, this is absolutely huge. However, it's not entirely unprecedented. Let us remember that US President Donald Trump is invoking so-called national security grounds to take trade action against Chinese companies. So we're starting to see an implosion of the WTO system and global trade rules as different countries start hammering other countries on trade, but over issues that are not really trade related. They're on political grounds or strategic grounds.
Okay. Now let's talk about the US's role in all this.
So fundamentally, the ROK in Japan must resolve these sensitive matters, and we hope that resolution happens soon. The United States, as a close friend and an ally to both, will do what it can to support their efforts to resolve.
우리는 우리 입장을 설명을 했고, 우리 이스라엘 차관보께서는 미국도 대화 재개를 통해서 이 문제가 해결되는데 도울 수 있도록 나름의 그런 노력을 해나가겠다는 그런 말씀을 하셨습니다.
Would the US playing a mediating role in this work favorably for South Korea?
I'm not sure that it would. I think that the U.S. will get more involved as they become worried that this might affect, again, their supply of electronic goods or economically. There could be some pushback from the business community in the U.S. They're probably more concerned about the security realm and how this affects what they want to be a trilateral alliance, but has been anything but that for, I don't know, the foreseeable past. So I think that's really the concern of the U.S., and they're just going to try to, as Stillwell said, do what they can to paper over this and try to get the two sides to find a way out of it.
But he tells me that they have a lot of friction going on now with respect to trade, primarily with respect to trade. And Japan has some things that South Korea wants, and he asked me to get involved. Maybe if they would both want me to, I'll be. It's like a full-time job, getting involved between Japan and South Korea.
Okay, let's now talk about South Korea sourcing these materials elsewhere. Because according to global ratings agency Fitch, South Korea is looking for alternative suppliers of semiconductor materials and said that it expects South Korea to successfully find them. In fact, following Japan's new export curbs, Russia has stepped up and offered to supply South Korea with the etching gas hydrogen fluoride, one of the 3 items that have been slapped with restrictions by Tokyo's government. Meanwhile, the Chinese media reported that South Korean semiconductor firms had recently ordered a large supply of hydrofluoric acid from China. Do you think South Korea could find a viable alternative of a viable source of these materials outside of Japan?
Long term, yeah. Short term, no.
How far is short term?
I can't answer that question, and South Korean companies aren't saying. We literally don't know their inventories, we don't know their supply chain organization, we don't know their logistics and so on. But it seems very, very clear from everything we're hearing that this has to be resolved very, very soon. Down the line, certainly they can diversify their import sources, but right now they are locked into and reliant on the relationship with these Japanese companies.
Sure.
I think what's interesting is what might happen long term. So again, I've mentioned that they're 90% exposed to this single supplier, and then they're going to go through this kind of pain here. They have maybe a month or 2 of inventories. I've heard different estimates on that. But let's say that this is wrapped up and this is solved in the coming couple of months. Certainly, the CEOs of Samsung and SK Hynix are going to think, well, we don't want that to happen again, and we're willing to pay a little bit more for those materials in order to prevent that from happening. And that will also encourage perhaps a decrease in the pricing that they'll have to pay, because there'll be more competition for the supply of these materials from elsewhere. And that's, I think, a real risk that these Japanese companies need to think about when they, encourage, or accept the government, imposing these types of trade restrictions over really a diplomatic issue.
So it seems quite clear that the consensus on this table is that it'll be a problem, at least for now. So there is definitely a dark cloud looming over South Korean economy. But President Moon Jae-in was not discouraged, vowing to turn this crisis into an opportunity.
우리 기업들은 일본의 소재, 부품, 장비에 대한 의존에서 벗어나 수입처를 다변화하거나 국산화의 길을 걸어갈 것입니다. 결국에는 일본 경제에 더 큰 피해가 갈 것임을 경고해 둡니다.
So if this trade war does in fact run into the long term, what can the Seoul government do to better prepare itself?
Well, I don't think it's up to the government really to prepare itself. I think it's up to the companies to reduce their exposure to single sources, while there is this looming, potential for diplomatic and so-called gunboat diplomacy, relying in 90% for critical components of your production line to one company that's in another country with which you have antagonistic relations probably isn't a good idea. And so I think that those companies are going to scratch their heads and come up with some other sources for those materials so that they can't be exposed to this type of trade spat in the future.
So you think it's more upon the companies
absolutely,
to come up with a solution
than the government.
Okay, we'll have to wrap things up here. If you were to give your own predictions, your own forecast for how this trade war will play out, as a news headline, how would you do it?
Trade spat growing into trade war. Trade war looming. I would say I don't think we've seen the end of this yet. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Okay, and Andrew?
I'll disagree with Frank. I'll say that this situation will be resolved, but it's not going to solve any of the underlying tensions. So I can say a headline something like, trade war cooled off, but tensions continue to simmer.
Okay.
Well, I think I tend to actually agree with you, Frank. My headline would be Korea-Japan trade war threatens stability in Northeast Asia.
Okay. All right, guys. Thank you very much for your input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
The escalating trade tensions between South Korea and Japan is threatening to become a global issue, and cool heads must prevail in order to prevent this situation from spiraling out of control. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.